Start echoing. Give me just a second. Come on. We'll start. Okay, there we go. Okay. All right, so just as a reminder of where we've been, um, when we left last Saturday, we just finished talking about defense mechanisms. And the thing that I encourage you to kind of start doing is in your everyday conversations and stuff like that, especially stressful conversations, start watching for some of these things to occur. And when they do occur, know it's time to change strategy, change the way you're approaching the individual, because this is a sign that they're becoming overprotective of themselves in Freudian terms, their ego. And really, it's if this continues, these defense mechanisms continue, the argument is going to become null and void. It's not going to go anywhere, or the conversation is going to be null and void because the person is going to be too busy protecting their ego to be able to actually listen or understand or grow from the situation that they're in. Okay. And this includes ourselves and realizing when we start to use these types of things, when we start to get stressed. Um, because this is definitely something that can happen in the professional atmosphere, especially when we're working with people who have things like severe trauma and we start to get vicariously traumatized. We can start displaying these behaviors, even in the group setting or the counseling setting, which is very harmful for the relationship between you and your clients. So it's a good idea to start realizing when you start using these defense mechanisms as well. Okay. But enough with that. So that was Freudian theory. Um, some things that we should just note from that is that he did very much focus on the idea that people come to a professional because they don't understand something core about themselves. Now, whether his theory of the unconscious mind and that being the reason, that's up for debate. But definitely this idea that people come to the group setting, to the counseling setting, because they don't understand or they feel like they just can't handle the situation is something we need to understand and make sure we have a breadth of. The next approach we're going to talk about is the humanistic approach. And if anyone has had Psych 101 with me, this probably sounds a little bit familiar. But humanistic theory started in the 50s and 60s, mainly in the counseling clinical area, um, where where therapists were becoming very frustrated with psychoanalysis, Freudian analysis, and behaviorism. Okay, which we'll talk about behaviorism when we talk about behavioral approaches here in a little while. But both behaviorism and Freudian psychoanalysis are both deterministic theories. Okay. You do what you do because of unconscious drives. You don't choose what you do. In behaviorism, you are where you are based on a reinforcement and punishment history. You didn't choose to be here. It's how you were reinforced and punished as you grew and developed that put you where you are. We don't have choice over our behaviors in these two models. Okay. Um, so the humanistic individuals came along and wanted to provide humans with the capacity to grow and develop, and have this thing called free will the ability to change one's life. And at the time in the 1950s, just to kind of give the philosophical background on humanistic theory, is in the 1950s, the world looked like hell in a handbag. I know the whole 50s, the house, the white picket fence and all that kind of stuff was really promoted, a time of peace, blah, blah, blah. But if we really think about the 1950s, we're entering the nuclear age, it's the Cold War. We're in battles in Asian countries and in places like the Philippines and Vietnam is starting to become contentious. We just came out of two world wars that started just 80 years after a hefty civil war here in the United States. And so the world looked pretty chaotic. And so a very popular theory started at that time called existentialism was a philosophy that a lot of people started to really get interest in because what existentialism states at its core is that the world, the universe, the suns, the moons, the planets, the fish in the water, all of it has no meaning. None of it has purpose. None of it. It's just chaotic haphazardness that is going on in the world. Okay, and to deal with this, if we put it more on a global stage, is that humans go through this existential crisis. Okay. If I'm born into a meaningless uh, universe, what does that mean? Well, I can create meaning out of nothing. So I can develop things like religion, government, schools, corporations, housing. I can create all of these things as humans that give my life some type of meaningless in a meaningless universe. Okay. And this is basically what is meant when someone is going through an existential crisis. Something has come along that has kind of blown that person's world apart and they're trying to figure out the meaning behind it and how they're going to get through it. That's what an existential crisis is if we think about it on an individual level. Okay. But the humanist who, the two famous individuals on this is Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, are going to come along and say, because we are born into a meaningless world and we create meaning out of it, we must have free will. We have to have that ability to choose to do that. So we have freedom to choose our destination. Okay. And some things about the humanistic approach that we need to know is stresses a person's capacity for personal growth, the ability to freely choose one's destination, and it focuses mainly on positive human qualities and bringing those out in the individuals. Okay. And this is probably the most important part about pure humanistic theory is humanist approach feels that each individual already has the capacity to solve their problems and it's our job to help them find those answers, to give them an environment that is safe, that is open for them to just say whatever they want to say, to feel whatever they need to feel, and to just be there for them to go through this process of hitting these barriers that are not allowing them to see the solution to their own problem. Okay. Um, if you want to think about this approach in like sitcoms and shows and like this is where the therapist, the person, so the client says something, that they went through during that week. Maybe they had a relapse or they had an argument or something like that. And the client asks, "So what do you think, doc?" Or What's going on? And the person goes, well, that's a good question. What do you think is going on? How do you feel about what happened? They don't give an answer. They encourage them to continue that dialogue. And so in a lot of sitcoms and stuff, when a person leaves the counseling office and someone says, so what did they tell you? They say, well, they didn't tell me anything. They just sat there and went, uh-huh, uh-huh, tell me more. Okay. That's the stereotype of a humanist therapist. Okay. Now, I will give you a little preview of why we're looking at this theory is the humanistic approach as a complete approach to counseling is not used widely. Okay. It's not something that most therapists use as their primary treatment modality. However, however, the majority of counselors and even group facilitators use the humanistic approach to develop that client professional relationship, that therapeutic relationship, because the humanistic approach, also known as the client-centered approach, completely focuses on the client and your relationship with them. It doesn't start with symptomology and diagnosis and all of those. It starts with developing a relationship. Okay. So let's go through the kind of major tenets of a humanistic theory, starting with Abraham Maslow. You probably have all seen this in one of your other classes at a work thing. It's a pretty popular kind of paradigm of what people need. Okay, and when we start at self-actualization, which is the top achievement that we want. It's what we're all driven towards, according to Maslow, is to become self-actualized. Okay. And this is achieving one's full potential, including creative activities. This is, in essence, knowing oneself completely. Okay. And being able to live yourself complete and what's the word I'm looking for? Um, without reservation. Being authentic is kind of what Maslow argued this self-actualization is. Okay. But he argued that we have to have certain things in place in order for self-actualization to occur. Okay. And if we go to the bottom of the pyramid, of course, we're going to look at physiological needs. Does a person have food, water, shelter, all of those things that make it so the person is physiologically capable? Okay. And then the person looks at safety needs. So, do they live in a safe neighborhood? Is there violence in the home? Is there gang stuff going on in the neighborhood? Those kind of things, those things that give us a sense of security. Okay. And then the third one is belonging. We have to feel like we belong. We have healthy relationships and boundaries in some cases with things like family and friends. Um, and then we have to feel good about ourselves, right? We have to, how do we feel about ourselves? Do we feel depressed, anxious, sad? What is our esteem? Okay. And when all of these things are in place, according to Maslow, then we can become self-actualized. We can come to a complete understanding of who we are. Okay. Now, I want to just emphasize some of the parts of this model that if you're going into social work, counseling, therapy, during the assessment process, this is everything that we assess, right? So when someone comes into the social work office or the counseling office, they fill out that initial paperwork. It usually asks them about sickness, illness, food, shelter, financial situation, all of those things. so that the social worker or counselor has a good understanding of whether they're meeting their basic physiological needs. And then we usually ask about things like domestic violence, trauma, childhood. Do they live in a safe neighborhood? Do they live in a safe house? And then we usually ask about their relationships with their intimate partners and friends and families to understand where their support systems are. And then we get to them and we measure things like depression and anxiety. We measure their esteem. How do they feel about themselves? And what we've done, what then the good social worker or counselor does is they put all of these together to create a case plan to help the individual in areas that they need assistance. The idea is while the client is working on building these areas with the social worker, in the counseling setting and in the group setting, they can work on this top of the pyramid. They can work on being a self-actualized person in that group process because all of these areas are currently being worked on. Okay. Now, that's a perfect world. That's a perfect model. That's where agencies have all the resources in the world to work with people. This is what we call a best practice model of helping people. I'm going to say it may not happen in all cases due to limited resources, limited education in some cases, and um, and the like. So just know that this is kind of that kind of perfect world picture of what we'd like get to see. Okay. So this was very helpful because all of these things are things that can be explored with a client. And again, in the pure humanistic model, you're trying to get them to figure out their problems on their own, usually. Today, we call this an empowerment model. But in more modern terms, there are some coping mechanisms we help them with and some thought ways to think about things to help. We just don't kind of sit there and kind of go, okay, figure it out. Come on, you can do it kind of thing. Okay. Um, so one of the probably more clear definitions of self-actualization was given to, I believe, by Carl Rogers, who really developed the humanistic approach. Okay. And he argued that we basically have two selves. We have an ideal self and we have a real self. Okay. The real self is who we are right here, right now, in this place, behaving, acting, and thinking. It's where we really live. It's how popular we really are. Okay. Our ideal self is that person we think we ought to be. So we ought to be the 4.0 student. We ought to be mother or father of the year. We ought to be employee of the month. We ought to be a rock star. We ought to be a social media influencer. We ought to be more cute than my friends or our friends. It's all those things we think we should be and that we, and sometimes aspire to be. Okay. Um, and what Rogers argued is that a self-actualized person is where your ideal self and your real self are one and the same. So if I were to draw a circle and each circle was oneself, let's say the red circle is the ideal self and the blue circle is the real self. They're kind of one and the same. They overlap. Okay. And what our Rogers argued is that the further apart these are from each other, the higher level of dysfunction a person experiences. Whoops. So the further apart these guys get, the higher level of dysfunction we see. All right. And I'll get to that here in just a minute. So, what does it mean, though, by having the ideal and the real self one and the same? It doesn't mean that you become the ideal self who you think you ought to be. And it doesn't mean that if you're in a situation where your housing isn't the best it is and everything else, that you stay there. No, it's your ideal self and real self become one and the same. And maybe you meet in the middle with everything and you come to have a complete understanding and acceptance of you. You accept your good qualities and what you're good at, and you accept your bad qualities, what you're not so good at. And this can include all the social stuff too. So you admit to yourself that maybe you're not a good friend. And that's why no one comes around because every time they do, I'm mean to them or I'm rude to them. And that's that level of self-acceptance and understanding that. And in that situation and only that situation can that person change that situation. And only in that moment the person could go, okay, there's something in me I need to change and work on that. On the other hand, they may be like a 4.0 student. Okay, let's say that. And they do excellent in classes. That's a good quality in by, school standards, I would think, or education standards. That's a good quality in someone. And so what do we do with that at that point? Well, we accept that we're good at that and we're proud of it. And we use what we learn by being a 4.0 student and we start applying it to those other areas of our life where we're maybe not so successful or not successful at all. And we use that quality as a way to enhance the self and the situation that we're in. Okay. So again, it goes back to that acceptance of who we are and completely accepting it and loving it. Okay. Now, with this, is there some notation about the real self and ideal self? Does it really create dysfunction? Yes, when we measure the distance using psychometrics and methods, the further apart a person's real self from the ideal self, the higher level of dysfunction we see, meaning the more intense depression symptoms, more intense anxiety symptoms, more intense even PTSD symptoms, and even in areas that you don't think that this idea would have a bearing on, even with schizophrenics, their delusions and their hallucinations are more intense when this real self and ideal self are distanced from each other. Okay. And so the idea behind humanistic treatment is to help a person have these things one and the same, a complete understanding of who they are. Okay. So how do we do this though, using this, thinking about these two models from Maslow and Rogers? Well, according to these, is we need to have what's called a person-centered theory. Okay. And there's a couple things on first on the what we want for our client is an understanding of their self-concept. And we have to provide what's called unconditional positive regard. Get to both of these. So what we want for our client is to have a complete understanding of their self-concept. Okay, so this is an individual's overall perception and assessment of their abilities, behaviors, and personality. We want to challenge them to really understand who they are. Now, how does this happen? How do we create this environment where a person can be completely and totally honest with themselves? Well, this is where what Rogers argued, unconditional positive regard comes into play. Okay. The basic definition of unconditional positive regard is accepting the values and being positive towards another person's behaviors and emotions. Now, what does that take? It takes self-actualization. Okay. And this is why if you go on to a master's program, most like in counseling, or even a doctorate program into clinical psychology or counseling psychology, you're going to spend the first year or two doing counseling on yourself. You're going to do self-counseling guided by a supervisor. Okay. Why? Two reasons. One, if you haven't gone through the counseling process and how you understand it, then you're not going to be a very effective therapist. Two, it provides that healing, and Rogers would argue, make it so your real self and actual self are one and the same, to where you come to a complete acceptance of who you are as a human being. Only when we accept our good qualities and our bad qualities can we accept other people for their good qualities and their bad qualities. And only in that condition can we become accepting of someone else's values, being positive towards them. That's the condition Rogers argued, that to develop unconditional positive regard, to set that environment for that exchange, you have to completely accept that person who is sitting in front of you. And you can only do that, according to Rogers, if you completely accept yourself. And that is the true condition of helping. Okay. Now, what else can we say about this? So, setting up this person-centered environment, does it really matter? Does it really have an effect on the client-counselor relationship? Okay. And there is some evidence that suggests yes, it does. Okay. For example, people who go to counseling who are not court ordered, they're not doing it as part of probation. They're going there on their own fruition because they recognize something is wrong with them or something's going off, whatever you may call that. And they're in there. And what happens is about the statistics vary from study to study. Anywhere from about 80 to 90% stop going after the first or second session. And this has made a lot of people go, well, what the heck is going on? Is it because of our approach? Is it because of the counselor? Is it because of cost? What reasons do people stop coming? And the original hypothesis was is maybe they thought it was a joke, they didn't get it, they didn't understand it, or maybe it was a payment issue or something like that, or maybe they didn't like the counselor. But that's not actually what they found. They found in around 85% of these cases where people stopped coming to counseling, they reported because they stopped having their symptoms. Their symptoms went away. And that was very curious. So they started to then do more in-depth interviews with these people about, well, your symptoms went away. We didn't really do anything therapeutic. We didn't do the counseling. We didn't do cognitive behavioral therapy. We didn't do those things. So you tell me, how did your symptoms go away? And many of them reported this simple thing, and I'm probably paraphrasing a lot of individuals, is they said, well, the thing is, and the reason they thought it helped is because it was the first time in their life that someone sat them down and told me that I can say anything I want anything I want, and that they're there just to listen to me, to hear me, and to just be there to listen. And many, thought they were being tested on this, so they did test the counselor, and the counselor just was there listening, engaging, wanting to understand more, saying, "Tell me more about that. Tell me more how you came to that." And for a lot of people, that is the first time they weren't judged when they were telling their story. They weren't getting this interruption of, well, what I think you should do is, what I think should happen is, they were just there and they were just listened to. Okay. And that's the power of this unconditional positive regard. And that's why most counselors start with the humanistic approach, because if you can establish that strong, understanding relationship between you and your client, all of the apprehensions about therapy kind of go away. Even with people who are court ordered to your treatment modality, if you could establish this relationship with this unconditional positive regard, a lot of the resistance you see in treatment, such as, "I don't belong here, I'm not an addict, I don't have an anger problem, it's because my wife did that, that made me do," all of those excuses, all of those defense mechanisms that we talked about are less likely to interrupt the counseling process, even with those, again, evidence suggests, even with those who are court ordered. Okay. So some things to kind of think about when you think about the process. Okay, we're going to skip these basic functions for right now, because I just want to go over some of these other models. So once again, we're going to come back to the humanistic approach as we start to say, how do we establish relationships with our clients? We'll keep in mind the Freudian ideas that people come to you for help, one, but also those people have defense mechanisms that they use to protect their ego. And one of our jobs is to identify when those are being used so that we can then facilitate some other way of helping that person. Okay. The the next approach that I'd like to kind of hit on is what's called the behavioral approach. Okay. Behavioral therapy became very, very popular, especially in the inpatient settings in the 40s and 50s and in the 60s, and well into some of the behavior modification programs into the 70s and 80s. Okay. Because it is kind of a simple approach to trying to help individuals overcome some problem. Okay. Because what behavioral approach does is, in a sense, it takes out the muddiness of memories and mental processes, and it focuses primarily on things that we have control in our external environment. Okay. So, in its most basic model for behaviorism, is that we have a triggering event, okay? And then we have some type of behavior, and we'll go through each one of these, okay? So we have some type of behavior that we do that is maladaptive, okay? That doesn't promote our health and well-being, okay? Now, dependent upon whether we were rewarded for that or punished for that, then will determine our future behaviors when that trigger comes around. Okay. Now, this is where we got to be very careful about being, remembering that we got to remember that the brain, I'm going to use brain terminology. The brain is amoral. Okay. It doesn't care about what the law thinks about a behavior. It doesn't care what your preacher or your pastor said you should or should not do. The brain's primary purpose is to make sure it has sufficient resources to keep you biologically sustained. And if you come across something that it feels is rewarding to the system, then that will cause that behavior to increase in the future. If it's punishing, it'll decrease it. Okay. So let's go through this from an alcohol and drug perspective because this approach is one of the approaches that is used in relapse prevention. Okay. In relapse prevention, one of the very first things we teach clients is to identify their triggers. Okay. Triggers being those things that ignite craving, um, um, start doing what's fantasizing about use, those kinds of things. So it may be driving by a bar or getting in an argument with a spouse or something that commonly led to drinking behavior in the past. This triggering event then creates behaviors. Okay. Um, Often in the addiction area, we talk about ritualized behaviors. We go through a ritualized process where we go through cravings have been triggered. I know I shouldn't use, but then in my head, I come up with justifications. I start doing driving behaviors. Maybe I go and get uh, a chicken nuggets from McDonald's, and then I think, gosh, the liquor store is just across the street. Um, and it's been a rough day, and so we go through these ritualized behaviors, okay? And in the relapse prevention, once we're stuck in that ritualized behavior, we drink, right? That's the behavior. That is then rewarded, which then leads to future behaviors. Karina, you have your hand up.
Yeah. So is that where like addiction comes in? Like so we've seen these behaviors until you kind of like look back and like okay, so addiction's happening. So do you offer like I'm sorry, I'm just trying to see the cycle. So is that where addiction comes in? So then I can like move forward. What if it is addiction, then how can we prevent it?
Right, Karina. So this is part of the addictive process. Once a person is going through a relapse and they can't stop, once the triggering events creates the behaviors, then the reward, that is the addictive process, right? Um, and so we'll go with this later in the class, we'll talk about relapse prevention where, okay, so as a therapist using the behaviorist approach, what are things that I can help my client do? Well, I can do exposure to triggers. That's an effective approach as long as it's in a controlled situation. I can uh, help them do what's called trigger avoidance. We can help on the behavioral end. We can start saying, let's start changing behaviors. Let's let if you've been triggered and you feel the urge to go get those chicken nuggets, knowing the liquor stores across the street, maybe you do something else. And then we focus on things like reward and punishment and look at, okay, it was rewarding, but it's also a punishment, right? And emphasizing this end a little bit more. Okay. So later on in the course, when we get to the relapse prevention, we'll come back to this model and go, okay, so these are strategies that we can provide the person who's going through the addictive cycle opportunities to make a different decision. Okay. And this is kind of one of the helpful models. We'll look at this in the cognitive model next. And this is why cognitive and behavioral models usually are used the same. You probably all have heard CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, because in both of the approaches, there's multiple areas of intervention that we can intervene on. In the behavioral thing, we can intervene on the trigger. If that doesn't work, we can try and intervene at the behavioral level. If that doesn't work, so we've already gone through relapse right here, right? Afterwards, we can try and help reanalyze whether that was rewarding and punishment and how that should determine future behaviors. So we have multiple areas of intervention. Okay. Now, I'm separating these models right now, but we'll combine them in a little while. But I wanted you to see how they work separately before we put them together. So the next approach is the cognitive approach. Okay. The cognitive approach works very similar to the behavioral approach, where we usually start with a trigger. Okay. But in the cognitive model, we have a thought. Okay. All right. And then we have the behavior, and then we have an appraisal period. Now, notice there's no reward or punishment, there's no probability of whether this will happen. And again, we have two thought processes instead taking over those areas. Okay. So the trigger, again, let's say a trigger for someone is um, getting in an argument with their spouse. That's triggering. A thought is it would reduce my anxiety to drink right now. It would help me out. I think I deserve it. Um, all of those kind of thoughts that go through an addict's mind that start to justify the behavioral process. Okay. And those thoughts then drive behavior. Okay. So in the behavioral model, the trigger automatically went to the behaviors. Okay. But in the cognitive model, we have a trigger, then we have a series of thoughts, and then we go through the ritualized behavior of addiction, and then and then we have an appraisal period after. Okay. So, for example, why is this important, this appraisal process? In a lot of individuals who are known as functional alcoholics, okay, this is where a person can go to work sober, usually miserable, work all day, and then get home and drink themselves to oblivion. Okay, that's one version of functional alcoholics. The appraisal process in the morning is usually, I'm never going to do that again. That was stupid. I can't believe I continue to do this. Da da da. What's different in the cognitive model is that we continually go through the appraisal process. So we start to go through our day at work, we start to feel better, we start to interact with all of these triggers again, like maybe the boss or the coworkers or whatever it may be, and then we're getting triggered and triggered throughout the day. That by the end of the day, we've done a reappraisal. And then it's going to go back to the moment we interact with that trigger again. We've reappraised the situation. The thoughts are going to be reinforced. So we're more likely to go through that ritualized behavior again. And so in the cognitive model, we have to understand that there's multiple stages as well. Okay. So again, with a cognitive model, we can start with the trigger, such using things like thought stoppers, not letting that trigger, refocusing. Some individuals use a rubber band when they start to trigger to kind of get them to stop triggering, especially individuals who have other disorders like OCD or autism. It's commonly used because a situation is triggering their symptomology. Okay. And then we can intervene on the thought level. We can intervene with, again, thought stoppers, thinking errors that people commonly do, reappraisal, challenging the thought, all of those kinds of things. So we have that intervention. And then again, using the behavioral approach, we have all of those approaches from the behavioral thing that we just talked about. Okay. And then, yes, in the cognitive model, we go through the appraisal process. And that's an important part of a lot of drug addiction group counseling is a lot of times you have the group come in, you ask them, have you had any relapses, you ask good things that happened during their week obviously, but then you ask, has anyone had any relapses? What happened? Those kinds of things. And you work with, in a healthy way, the appraisal process. So in the group treatment setting, someone says, yes, I had a relapse last week. I've had a really hard time with it. And you go through that with them and the group. And you go, okay, well, let's talk about what happened. What do you think caused the addictive behavior? And you help them reinterpret anything that they feel will lead them to use again in the future. Okay. And that's kind of the cognitive approach. Now you'll notice, unlike the psychoanalysis and unlike the humanistics, these are much more structured ways of thinking about helping people. Okay. And so we're getting more into the therapy than the development of relationships with our clients when we're talking about these models. Okay. So I just want to emphasize that point. All right, gang, let me see. What do we have next? All right. Okay, and this just combines again, we went through the behavioral process. So this is cognitive behavioral kind of therapy, where we usually start with thoughts, the behaviors, we add in reinforcement and then evaluation and thought. And it becomes a addictive cycle for some. It becomes a reinforcing cycle for things like depression and anxiety, OCD behavior, and all of those things. And the point is that we can have interventions at each four of these circles to try and help the person overcome the cycle that they're in. Okay. All right. And this just gives a kind of a worded definition of it. So I'm going to leave this up here for right now. And I'm going to propose, give me, do you guys want a 5 minute break or a 10 minute break? We're at 10:55 right now. You can just put it in the chat, 5 or 10. Rochelle's going 10, 10, 10, 10. All right, gang, let's go ahead then and come back at 11:05 and we'll finish up with some of these models. All right, so 11:05 and we will return.